Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with Essential Works for Beginners. In this case, the composer we're talking about is Igor Stravinsky. Now, Stravinsky is one of those guys who wrote a couple pieces that are just incredibly popular, and then a ton of stuff that isn't. In fact, most of what he wrote isn't. And a lot of it deserves to be because it's really just marvelous music. But it does take some getting used to. He was very, very concerned as a composer with being at the forefront of musical development, always, of being as avant-garde as he possibly could be within, his own stylistic predilections. And so we're going to talk about the most popular pieces, some of them anyway, and some of the less popular pieces, but pieces which are essential if you want to get a handle around what Stravinsky was doing. Now, one of the things Stravinsky is extremely famous for is saying that music expresses absolutely nothing other than itself. His own aesthetic, I wouldn't say aesthetic, his expressive ambit, shall we say, was rather cool. He was not an emotional composer. You're not going to hear heights of romantic passion, depths of tragedy. He was very funny. He was a very funny guy, and some of his music is really quite funny. He was best off as a composer for the dance, as a ballet composer, but he wrote a lot of marvelous music in other forms. After ballet, his real forte, and this will surprise you, was religious music. Vocal music. And the reason his religious music is so effective is that he understood that in order to create a spiritual quality in music, you wanted something that sounded almost inhuman, something that was emotionally not exactly cold, but spacey, but grand, but otherworldly. And that was something he was really quite good at. And so when you get to his latest works, which are written in a very personal version of 12-tone or atonal style, these are all religious works because the feeling of alienation, of being divorced from the music, is important to that creation of distancing, of alienness, of cool otherness that we usually describe as spiritual music, music that is more than human, music that exploits instruments and voices where necessary in ways that don't sound like an opera singing about love and death and that kind of stuff. It's all beyond that. And that's really a very interesting aspect of his art. It was a way that he could turn his natural inclinations, which were not to be a romantic, expressive type composer, to best use, and to best use in a very, very remarkable field. Now, this list, which is the way to get started with Stravinsky, does not include that late music, but it does include some sacred music. And very powerful music it is. Sacred music and operatic music, where he's absolutely wonderful in what he's doing. But we start with his most famous piece, which is the Rite of Spring, a musical revolution, if ever there was one. A revolution in rhythm, in orchestration, a revolution in ballet. It caused possibly the most famous riot ever in musical history at its premiere, which was around 1913. And it's become famous not as a ballet, but as a concert work, because nobody wants to see a bunch of proto-barbarians in burlap jumping up and down and grunting for 30 minutes. When you watch a ballet, you want to see something that involves, danceable artistry. And really, the music itself is so graphic and so powerful and so rhythmically pulverizing that it kind of overwhelms whatever choreography you might want to dream up for it. And so it's performed separately, and rightly so. It's in two parts. It lasts about half an hour. And it's just as exciting as hell. It was the music that Walt Disney used in Fantasia to do the dinosaurs, the fight with the Tyrannosaurus Rex and the Stegosaurus and the volcanoes going off, and then the theory of evolution, single-celled organisms becoming more complex. And it was a wonderful cartoon equivalent. He didn't use the whole work, Walt Disney. He used bits of it. And when Stravinsky was upset with that, Walt Disney said, well, it's not under copyright, we'll just use it anyway. And so Stravinsky said, never mind, I'll take the royalty. And he tolerated it. But it really is an extraordinary experience and fun. It's just fun to listen to. You know, you just listen to the rhythms and the really gnarly harmonies and some screechy chords. But the irony of it is that for all of its modernity, it's all based on folk music. And you hear these bits of folk music all the time. You know, da 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 dum bum. I mean, it's a Russian folk song. Ya da 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 dum ba da 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 dum. Just these little fragments which Stravinsky is working with, because Stravinsky was not a great melodist. Stravinsky was at his best when he had a model, something he could take that pre-existed, and then he could Stravinskify it. And so the Rite of Spring is one of his Stravinskified creations, and a lot of the pieces we're going to talk about are that way. They sound like nobody else, but sometimes the models are very, very clear and very interesting as well. I adore the Rite of Spring. I mean, it's an amazing piece of music, and it sounds as fresh and crazy as the day that Stravinsky wrote it. It's absolutely fabulous. So that's where you got to start. And you just put it on, crank it up, let it rip, and have a good time. It's just good, clean fun. It really is. So we have the one sort of initial basis of Stravinsky's operation, the dance, a ballet, folk music, and that kind of influence. Now, the next influence is, like I said, is that of sacred music and vocal music, of which he wrote a surprising amount. It's the Symphony of Psalms. It's a glorious work, scored for choir and a very interesting ensemble, which has no violins. It's lower strings and lots of woodwinds and two pianos and a harp and the bass drum and things like that. Now, this piece has 3 psalm settings. It's in 3 movements. It's extremely beautiful and extremely, well, what could I say? It shows you exactly how Stravinsky uses his music to try and create an aura of spirituality, even if the music itself is quite dissonant at places, especially the second movement, which is a fugue. There's a contrapuntal thing. Well, it's a double fugue, actually. There's like an instrumental fugue with a vocal one on top of it. It doesn't matter. You don't have to worry about it. The whole piece is only a bit more than 20 minutes long. His setting of the text is very, very interesting, because in many ways the music does the opposite of what the words say, but it makes the point by being, well, like spiritual sounding. The finale, for example, which begins with an Alleluia, is all about, it's the 150th Psalm, I think. It's all about praising God with cymbals and noise and, Alleluias and all this stuff. But the music itself is actually very meditative in places. And there is a more obstreperous middle section where fireworks do go off momentarily. But then the end does something that Stravinsky often does. It represents a moment of frozen time. There's what they call an ostinato, a repeated bass motive that goes over and over, and it doesn't have to be the bass. In this case, it is. It's in the timpani. And the choir sings above this, a very repetitious, somewhat chant-like formula. And the result of that is indeed as if time has become suspended, and you're dealing with eternal things, which is what Stravinsky is always after in his choral music, in his sacred music, and often in his instrumental music too, as we'll see in a moment. So the Symphony of Psalms is an extraordinary work, and I've heard it many times, and I actually played piano in it once. Not terribly well, but it's not a terribly difficult part, and it really is kind of an amazing thing, and one of his most popular vocal works. After the Symphony of Psalms, I would go back to the ballet with Petrushka. Now, Petrushka preceded the Rite of Spring immediately. Before that came The Firebird, which is one of Stravinsky's most popular pieces, but it's not in this list because, quite frankly, I don't think it's one of his better pieces. It made an extraordinary impression at its premiere. It's an interesting work. It's his longest ballet, It's about 50 minutes long. It's a big thing. And you'll hear the suite, which is quite popular. Everyone knows how the finale goes, right? Da 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 dum ba da 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 dum. And now I'm talking about it, and it's not on the list. That kind of makes it on the list, I know. But I chose Petrushka as more important because, first of all, it's a greater work. And second of all, it's incredibly fun to listen to. And thirdly, it gives you another sense of how Stravinsky's endings are always a little bit off. They're never quite what you expect, or often, not in the Rite of Spring, where you've got the dance of virgin sacrifice. But, the Petrushka is about a puppet. And it's an amazing piece because it's about the inner life of a puppet. You have crowd scenes in the outer sections. There are 4 tableaux. Those are crowd sections. And in the inner section, it's a love story between Petrushka and a ballerina and the Moor, who is in love with the ballerina and who does nothing but beat up Petrushka. Petrushka gets roundly clobbered by the Moor. And at the end, the very end, the two worlds, the public world and the private world, collide. And Petrushka the puppet is killed. And the charlatan, the puppet master, who is doing all this stuff, is horrified when he sees that his puppet actually sort of turns into like a real character, a real thing with a real life. And at the very end, Petrushka has been killed. He's a broken puppet. You drop a tambourine on the floor, and Petrushka's dead. And after that, the ghost of Petrushka haunts the puppet master, comes in and freaks him out. And the ending is one of those frozen time moments, which is quite shocking, actually, and indecisive. It's a wonderful piece. And I think that really, in many ways, it's as exciting as the Rite of Spring, and it's even more difficult to play rhythmically in the outer sections. In some places, it's really hard. It has a brilliant part for solo piano. It is also full of Russian folk tunes, but unlike the Firebird, they're better integrated into the flow of the drama, to the flow of the ballet. In the Firebird, you have tunes, Russian folk song tunes, which became the suite that we know and love. And then all of this filler stuff in a completely different style, a different harmonic style, which is quite interesting, actually. But for me, they sit uneasily together. And so I would prefer that you start with Petrushka and the Rite of Spring and then go back and listen to the Firebird, because I think you'll be in a better position to appreciate what Stravinsky does there, because a lot of it's magnificent, it really is, but it does have its dead spots. So after Petrushka, I would do Orpheus. Now, after these 3 initial ballets, that is the Firebird, Petrushka, and the Rite of Spring, Stravinsky turned to a neoclassical idiom, looking toward the Baroque and the classical eras in order to find inspiration and musical materials. And Orpheus is I think, the greatest of all of these neoclassical ballets. There's a bunch of them. There's Apollo, and there's Persephone, and there's several. We don't have to go through all of them. But Orpheus is the story, of course, of Orpheus, the god of music. And he gets torn to bits at the end by the bacchantes, those, drunken, psychotic women things, after his beloved Eurydice is lost to him forever in hell. It's a coolly beautiful, marvelous work. But the coolness is really the essence of it. It has this, what Stravinsky would have called a classical beauty, a classical purity of utterance. And it has that without ever becoming arid or sterile, which is a real risk in some of Stravinsky's works, and particularly the neoclassical ones, where he's trying so hard not to be expressive that he succeeds. And we don't like that always when he succeeds. Orpheus has enough meat on its bones to be a wonderful exemplar of a different style in which the expression is harnessed within the expressive parameters of the neoclassical style. And Stravinsky was the avatar of neoclassicism, a style which was considered to be the opposite of the other avant-garde, which was the second Viennese school, the atonalists, Schoenberg, Berg, and Webern. So those two were going in opposite directions until Stravinsky, moved over to the dark side at the end of his career. But it's really a lot more subtle than that. That's the story in a nutshell. Orpheus is a single movement, about 30 minutes long, and it's really special and incredibly lovely work. And if you like abstract, think of it as abstract. I find it to be enormously expressive of its kind. And it's the kind that you need to get used to. After Orpheus, well, we go to another opera, or an opera oratorio, an operatorio, Oedipus Rex. Well, you all know the story. Oedipus Rex, I think, is one of Stravinsky's very greatest works and one of the most fascinating things he ever did, because it tells the story in Latin, which he deliberately chose because he thought or hoped nobody would understand it. He didn't want you to understand the words. He wanted you to see the enacting of a mythological, universal story with a narrator who says, now you're going to hear what happens. And then you hear it in a language that you don't understand, but the music is describing what happens in its own way. And this music takes references from everything. And I don't want to go into that too much because, if you don't know Mozart, or if you don't know Verdi, or if you don't know this, or you don't know that, you think, oh, well, I'm not getting it. That's not true. You get it exactly the way Stravinsky intends, whether you know anything about his sources or not. If you know those sources, it brings an extra soupçon, an extra smidge of I think, interest in listening. But it's not a critical fact, and you shouldn't dwell on it. You should do exactly what Stravinsky wants you to do, which is listen to the narration, then just let the music wash over you with its Latin words. And if you know a little bit of Latin or some of the words sound familiar, so much the better. If they don't, it's fine, because the story is incredibly moving, incredibly powerful, and told in a style that is in some places almost insane. I mean, there's a duet in the second part between Jocasta and Oedipus that sounds completely nuts. I mean, totally loony. It's almost cartoon music. And part of the power of the story is that sometimes the music that Stravinsky uses is so completely contrary to what we know is happening that it's disturbing. He disturbs us through the musical discontinuity between what the words are saying and what the music is doing. And it's not music that's making fun of the story. It's describing the story, but it describes the story and accompanies the words in a way which is extremely questioning of what's going on. It makes you think. It really makes you think. And the piece is marvelous. There's a chorus, of course, because it's a Greek tragedy, a male chorus. And then there are, 5 or 6 characters, mostly, Oedipus and Jocasta, of course, his wife and mother, by the way, and Creon and Tiresias, the prophet. And that's basically a shepherd. And that's who you have. And as the story eventually unfolds, as the narrator describes what's happening, we become more and more aware of the inexorability of fate, the terror of what's happening to this man who has no clue what's going on until the very end, and then he blinds himself and he is forced out of Thebes, and the end is exactly as it began. Actually, it ends just like the beginning, but he leaves it's so moving. And it's moving because it's being done in an objective kind of way. I mean, there's no such thing as objectivity in music, really, but Stravinsky comes as close as you can get. So after Oedipus Rex, we're going to talk about another one of his neoclassical pieces, Pulcinella. Now, Pulcinella is a ballet with songs, and it's based on music primarily by an Italian Baroque composer named Domenico Gallo. But at the time he wrote it, Stravinsky thought it was the Italian composer Pergolesi. It wasn't. There is a little bit of Pergolesi in it, but most of it is Gallo. And what's fascinating about Pulcinella is that, songs aside, the singing parts aside, the music is almost unchanged, but it sounds totally like Stravinsky. It's incredible what he does. If you listen to the Domenico Gallo trio sonatas, they're called, meaning sonatas with 3 voices and 3 parts, you hear all the tunes. You almost hear the rhythms. I mean, Stravinsky diddles the rhythm. And of course, the trio sonatas are for 2 violins and harpsichord, accompaniment called the continuo. But Stravinsky uses a chamber orchestra with a trombone and flutes and piccolos and woodwinds and horns and whatnot. So it's more colorful. But wow, he has to do very little to make this music sound so modern. And the piece is incredibly sweet, incredibly charming. And, for music that supposedly isn't about anything, it really is extremely expressive. It's beautifully written and elegant and it has a certain what would you call it, a classical, a baroque? It's neoclassical, but it has that poise, that wonderful feeling of line and structure and elegance. An amazing piece of music and a delight to hear. It really is. And you can get it in suite form without the singing, or the whole thing with the singing. And however you want to do it, just do it the way you want. It doesn't make any difference. It's a lovely, lovely work. And finally, the last piece, and it's the most difficult work on this list, actually, is Les Noces, which means in French, the wedding. It's svadebka in Russian, I think. It's a Russian wedding ceremony in 4 bits. It is taking the rhythmic inventions of the Rite of Spring and the folk song bits and setting it as a choral ballet. It's sung throughout. It's written for a very eccentric ensemble of 4 pianos and percussion and nothing else. And the music is pure rhythm based on the syllables, based on the rhythmic stresses of the Russian language. The original performance was in French, a translation that Stravinsky hated so much that when he first recorded it, he did it in English, actually. But it really works best in Russian. And again, it's one of those situations where you don't need to understand what the words are. It doesn't even help sometimes to understand what the words are. But the music is chant-like and primal, really, really primal. One of the things about Stravinsky, and you can hear it in virtually all of these works, maybe not so much Pulcinella, but in virtually all of the others, is that he was trying to get at the very essence of what music could be. This kind of primal sense, the spiritual sense, this thing beyond the notes that he didn't call emotion or expressivity, but it's there. It's in what the music is and what it's doing. And Les Noces, which is only about 20 minutes long, is one of the most remarkable creations that way, because it does sound like a primitive ritual. It is a ritual. It's a liturgy in its way. And because it's all based on rhythm and chanting and this sort of incredible constant energy, this outpouring of rhythmic tension and life and vitality, the music has a feeling that it's always existed, that it's been there since the dawn of time. And Stravinsky didn't so much compose it as uncover it, dig it up, find it. He used real Russian folk songs, real Russian liturgical chants from the wedding ceremony, but the result of it goes beyond all that. It speaks of essential things. And Stravinsky's best music does that. He does it in the Symphony of Psalms. He does it in the Rite of Spring. He does it in Orpheus and Oedipus Rex. He does it however different all these pieces are, and however much his style evolved over time. There is always that sense of something essential in our being, in the way the universe is, in his best music. And I think these pieces will give you a very, very good sense of that in many different ways. And that's what I'm hoping that you'll hear when you play this music and get to know it. And as with all of these things, do please take your time. Do not rush. Get to know the music. If you think it's difficult, stop, take it off, come back to it when you feel ready. Some of it is challenging, but it's worth the time and worth the challenge. And to get the best recordings, as always, please go over to classicstoday.com and have a look at the reviews there, or you can look at my videos on the individual works that I mentioned in this particular list, because I've talked about most, if not all of them at various times, and there are reviews of all of them for sure at classicstoday.com, and those reviews are free, and you could just look and see what's out there. But listen to it, internalize it, and see how you respond to it. See how you deal with the issue of expressivity, the issue of the transcendental, the sacred. I mean, this music really does address some very, very basic issues about what music can be, what it can mean, and how it relates to you as the listener. And that's why Stravinsky is an endlessly fascinating composer and one of the great voices in Western music, and certainly of the 20th century. So keep on listening, friends. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.